Open the floor to comments and questions from the floor. And Julie's hand was first, and she's in the front row, so go to... Okay, there we are, and you're going to get a microphone right there.
It's not working.
I don't hear it, no. So I think she's...
No.
Yes. Oh, thank you for the lights. That's working.
Testing?
Yeah.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay.
Just following on the last presentation, which completely fascinated me, and I'm sure I will have more to ask the speakers about later on, but just a couple of very quick inquiries. Okay, got it. To both or either. First of all, I wanted to know where the entrance is to the Saadat in Qazvin. How do you get in there? Where do you start? If you're talking about a promenade, you start from the bottom and work up to the pavilion, or what? Second question is, do you see a connection between the 8 chapters of the Sharat Zara with the idea of the Hasht Behesht? And third, in poetic texts, the predominant color of the garden in autumn is gold. Is this reflected in either of the texts that you two have been dealing with?
I can answer the first question, and then Mohammed can answer the second. In the text on the garden at Saadatabad in Qazvin, we have some account of 2 structures. One of them being the Ali Kapu, and the other being the Chehel Satun or the Kola Farangi. And it seems that the Ali Kapu is more on the outside. Even today, if one looked at the remains of both these buildings, the Ali Kapu is more like a gate to something that lies beyond. In fact, the description in the text is about walking through the Ali Kapu and going within to the garden. We are not sure whether that route of going from the Ali Kapu to the Kola Farangi or the Chehel Satun was a direct one. It seems to have not been a direct one. There were probably a number of partitions created by vegetal matter or by walls that were transparent, semi-transparent, but the text actually compels one not to walk directly. It actually compels one to take this easy route that allows one to experience the best parts of the garden. So the text cannot be really used as a way to reconstruct the garden, except reconstruct the aspects of moving through the garden and interpreting the garden.
Just to complete Manu's answer, there is no reference to the entrance in Jannatul Asmar. So there is no reference to, and there is more emphasis on the interior of the pavilion and the beauty of the garden, especially in terms of horticulture, fruits, and to some extent flowers, but not the main roads, streets, and the entrance. Back to your second question, I think there is definitely a relation between the Hasht Behesht and if you are referring to the Hasht Behesht in Isfahan and the one in Herat, in Irshad al-Zira, especially considering that we know Shah Abbas was raised in Herat, and he was fascinated by all these gardens that existed in Herat, and some say that even one of the reasons that he kind of encouraged the idea of coming up with a master plan for the city of Isfahan was the influence of his childhood experience in Herat. So in that sense, there is a huge cultural interaction between Herat and Isfahan at that time. And you want to answer the
Yeah,
third question?
I just want to add a little bit to the reconstruction of the other garden, the garden described by Haravi. Apparently, when we picked up our first drawing of that particular garden from Maria Subtelini's article on that particular garden, where she describes the garden and she proposes a reconstruction. But, you know, even though we are architects, even though we can think about physical space and we are very tempted to try to reconstruct it in our own terms, we tried very hard, and I think we succeeded in getting away from the physicality of the artifact itself. Subtelini proposes the entrance to that particular garden on the west, on the lower west side. And in fact, one of the plans that I showed had an entrance on the lower west side. We, on the other hand, negated the entrance. We were not thinking about it. We were thinking more about the aspect of coming in and then what happens. So.
Yes. Go ahead.
My question is also for the last presentation, which I thought was very nicely delivered between the two of you. I was intrigued that Haravi's Persian garden doesn't seem to have any place for the cypress, which, as we know from literature and paintings, was very much a staple of the Persian garden, and which is moreover an evergreen, if we're thinking of colors, as compared to, I think maybe its substitute in this case is the poplar in its stature, which, if one compares it to the cypress, I don't know, in certain parts of the world would be considered a cheap substitute for the cypress. I wondered if you had any thoughts on that, which struck me as interesting.
You're absolutely right, but Haravi is very specific about poplar. In fact, he says, poplar shall border the garden and not pine. And he writes, parenthesis, not pine. So he's very particular about that particular species. And we're not sure why that particular aspect is there, but he doesn't talk about poplar, about cypress in there.
Because the poplar grows faster and makes that stature faster than the cypress, which takes longer.
Well, actually,
Sheds its leaves and maybe is more interested in the winter effect. The cypress doesn't survive.
possibly, yes.
Another question? Oh, hands up. Oh, yes, down here.
Well, the first thing is saying you thank you for this very nice and interesting Congress. And I have a question for Maribel Fierro from this morning about the red and the yellow. And my question is, where is the border between yellow prom or red prom? For example, Nazaris, they built the Alhambra Palace, it's red. But during the 14th century, they developed a lot the Fatimi lusterware, that at that time it was yellow, it was golden, and they used it as decoration, for example, with the big Alhambra bases today at the Archaeological National Museum in Madrid. So where is the border between red prom or yellow prom? Thank you. Al amarillo, porque tanto construyeron en rojo como decoraron cosas importantes como los vasos de la Alhambra.
Okay, I understand now. The thing is with the Nasrids is that
I'm not sure is the microphone working?
with the Nasrids, what we find is that on the one hand, the founder calls himself the son of the red, so they seem to be following the Almohads in the preference for red, and they want to show a certain continuity with the preference for red. On the other hand, the genealogy they adopt is a Yemeni one. So in that sense, they would have to use yellow. So what I will expect in the Nazrites is a combination of the two colors. So because having adopted a Yemeni genealogy, then you would expect them to call themselves Ibn al-Asfar. Instead, they call themselves Ibn al-Ahmar. So at this point, they are playing with both colors.
So there is not a clear border.
No, not with them. I wouldn't expect with them. I mean, I'm not an art historian, so I don't dare to go too much into the use of colors, apart from the genealogy or the historical documentation that I have. But what I will expect from them is to use both colors. Thank you.
Some more questions? Yes, Jesus.
My question is for Noha Sadek. I appreciated your talk a lot, and I think this question is sort of inspired by Michael's discussion of multidirectional forces. And with the introduction of domes with squinches in Yemen, it seems you've proven that there are foreign builders there. And so my question is, really, can you speculate on what agency those foreigners might have had in creating this new architecture of power, as you're calling it?
Thank you for your question. It's an open, it really is an open question. I mean, how can we assess that? Is not an easy one. So I'm not sure how to answer your question, actually. Yeah.
Maybe can you just speculate on where these foreigners might have come from?
Oh, yes. I mean, anywhere. Anywhere within ties with Egypt and Syria, as well as Iran. They don't specify where they come from. I mean, they talk about foreign craftsmen, but I mean, I didn't want to say that they were exclusively. That this architecture was exclusively constructed by foreigners at all. Yemenis have always been builders since ancient times. So the dome, I'm suggesting that yes, the dome is foreign and probably came in with the Ayyubids. So just slightly earlier, I mean, the Rasulids came with the Ayyubids into Yemen. There are no Ayyubid buildings still standing in Yemen, even though there are some buildings with Ayyubid names, but they've been they're changed. And so yes, the dome is foreign to Yemen after all. But
If I could just add, I think already if we're moving into the 14th century, you can talk about indirect transfer. That is not just people, but this would be the time that paper is readily available in large sheets, standard size sheets. So you could have had drawings and you could have had sections and things like that.
But of course, you'd have to have people who knew how to read them.
Yes.
and that may also, I've always pondered upon on the absence of the muqarnas in Yemen. Why it didn't, they stopped short of using it in Yemen. So why it is, again, difficult to answer.
Yes?
Actually, this is a bit of a follow-up on the previous question, because I also put these two wonderful papers together in my mind. Michael Scheffler's point about cosmopolitanism struck me, this idea that the cosmopolitan sensibility that these materials that you analyzed convey beyond the how and why, the transfer or the description. They convey a certain cosmopolitan outlook. And I was wondering also about your presentation, Noha, if you have any evidence of patronage of the Rasulid dynasty extending to India. And I know we have textual evidence for patronage of Islamic Muslim communities by giving money for imams and so on and so forth. But do we have architectural patronage or any evidence for it?
No. Outside of Yemen, no. There are tombs in Gujarat that resemble, there are connections to some Rasuli tombs, but that's all there is, but not.
Or craftsmen being sent.
Possibly, yes. I mean, I think all of that is going through the trade routes. Yemenis were great traders as well. I mean, as well as others. I mean, it's sort of passing through Aden and ports along the Red Sea. And so there's a lot of movements. There was also a big Chinese expedition in the early 15th century there were seven expeditions actually from the Ming dynasty that came to Yemen. And so, you know, possibly also craftsmen from there. I mean, one cannot exclude all this, I mean, movement back and forth.
So did I see one way in the back and then over here? So first in the back, all the way in the back, way in the back.
Gracias. First of all, thank you. And I want to congratulate all of those that has proposed and take decisions to have this symposium here in Córdoba. Thank you very much. I have two questions. The first one is for Maribel Fierro. It's about the colors of the flags. As you know, the Andalusian flag is green and white. It's like the Spanish flag, but green instead of red and white instead of yellow. But yesterday you was talking about the yellow Umayyan flags. Where these green flags of old come from? Do they have really scientific base, or they just invented that the Andalusian flag were green?
Well, there is a text of the 11th century that mentions a green and white flag being used in Denia by one of the Taifa kings there. So that color, that possibility in flags existed as well. White and green is usually associated, especially the green, is the association that I find in the text is mostly with paradise and with the Alid family. And the white is mostly Umayyad. So I would look, the green is the most prominent part, so I would say I would look to this in this direction. Okay. But there is a precedent, if you can call it. I mean, we know that one of the flags used in Al-Andalus was green and white.
And not yellow, for example.
No, not yellow, yeah.
Thank you very much. Mm-hmm. And I have a second question for Manu and Mohammed regarding the Gardens of Islam. Okay, I cannot point to origin or a document or author, but I live in Córdoba. And since my youth, long past, I have, quote, known, unquote, that when the Muslims built their gardens in Madinat al-Sara or in El Generalife, they also used scents, I mean smells, textures as when you walk, and also the noise, the music of the water. I was hoping that you will have reflect that in your position, but unfortunately, does it have any scientific base? I ask the same that I asked before to Maria, because they said the Caliph could choose, if he was sad, for example, take a light path with a fine sand, sweet scents, not very heavy, and probably soft, subdued colors in the flowers or vegetation. And probably light, acute noise of water dripping on a flat surface, for example, and so on and so on. Does that have any base of reality, or is just some invention I heard somewhere?
Well, the fact is we actually want to move towards making that kind of model, I would call it. But in some ways, we had students who already have this information in the computer, And the next step is to actually take it and make an animation based on this information so that you can start looking at it as if in real time, in real space. I, however, personally, and I think Mohammed agrees with me, we are a bit skeptical about how far we ought to take it. Because I think the texts here provide us definitive evidence about the appearance, about what kind of plant materials are out there. We can, I think, at most elaborate, we can sort of extend it to the smell of the plants. We can extend it to the kinds of species that were available at that particular point in time. The one thing that we confess we have not done is that we have not looked at, the origins and the development and how should one say, the biological evolution of the species, each one of which have been mentioned here. For example, we still don't exactly know what kind of an apple looked an apple in the 15th or the 16th century. Was it small? Was it large? We know that Kazakhstan, for example, has, an almost extinct set of apple trees, which is the origin of the apple all over the world. Now, what kind of apple existed in Herat? What kind of apple existed in Qazvin? We still don't know. And this is another part of our research where we need to consult with people who will give us that kind of information. So I don't think we want to take it into a dry, very easily doable computer animation. That was a thought, but it's been shelved for some time.
In this stage of research, we try to be, remain loyal to what we had. And what we had was these two manuals. And in none of them there was reference to the sound of birds, even though we know that, especially in that region, it's very important that the sound, especially water, birds, and also the way that light is modified among these trees, and also the texture of flowers. And we can assume that, and hopefully in the next stage of research we will realize if the arrangement of flowers and plants, especially in these 9 plots that you saw in Irshad al-Zara'a, is there really a rule there, a regulation that is kind of determining the texture of flowers, is controlling the softness and in garden or not?
Just to extend on what Mohammed is saying, the one thing that I think will make everyone happy, in particular Sheila and Jonathan, is that by the time we get to the publication, we will have birds and animals in those, because we have the birds and animals. Actually, I have them all. It's just that we've not put them in the drawing. So we'll get a drawing like the Baburnama illustration that I showed you, with the text next to it. It seems a bit kind of
Should we ask Jillian whether we can have a pop-up book?
I think there was a question right there. Yes, indeed.
First, I want to say thank you for the amazing conference. It's fantastic to come to a place like Cordoba and just hear about color. I would like to see a little bit more color than hear about it, but that's another subject. The last presentation about the gardens. Not a lot of people have the privilege to have gone to Iran and have to experience the beauty and the colors of Iran, where maybe 80% of the art that was discussed is actually from Persia, to include manuscripts and luster tiles and the magnificent gardens. And the whole purpose of creating the gardens was to get rid of the barren surroundings of Iran and to create al-Fardaus, and to create heaven on earth. And like in the movie, I don't know if you've seen the movie Rang-e Khuda, the colors of paradise, where there's an exuberance of color. I would have really liked to see the gardens. And we talked about a list of gardens, and I was trying to visualize them in my head, although I'm half Persian, so I've seen the magnificent gardens of Iran, but trying to imagine the peach and the quince and the deep blue purple plum and the orange and the nanjri. I would have really liked to see the gardens that people that have not been to Iran to see the gardens in Isfahan and Shiraz. There was a magnificent exhibit 3 years ago at the Contemporary Art Museum in Tehran, and the title was Baghaye Iran, and the gardens of Iran, where you had beautiful photographs of the gardens. You had installations outside in the park, but you also had visiting rooms that you could go in and you could hear the sounds of the water of the gardens of Isfahan, the smell of the flowers of the gardens of Isfahan, the 3 and 4 seasons. So my question was there a reason today at the presentation that you did not share with the audience the experience of Al-Firdaus in spring, summer, winter, and autumn?
We actually had a drawing called the 4-season drawing.
No, the real thing. I mean, the title says the hues of paradise, Rang Khuda, Rang Firdaus. And it says, you talked about that the purpose and the goal of the gardens was the color experience, that Tabrizi was disturbed by the walk through the gardens of all the colors. And it is the source of color for most of the Islamic art. And it's a shame that we didn't get to see the gardens.
Well, I'm going to step in, and I'm just going to, as sort of one of the organizers, and I actually think it was good to have drawings, because I think, in a way, I think what I'm getting to understand from what you're saying is that you don't want to make it too specific. You want to inspire us to, your memory, it's quite clear from what you're saying, your memory of a garden is far more vivid than any real garden ever is. And we have to remember that a photograph is also a kind of representation, and it's not the real thing. And so we should, and in this way, we're not relying too much on a photograph, but rather on stirring the imagination, which is really what the garden was about.
And the other thing is that showing a photograph could be also at the same time, very misleading, because because now we are realizing, actually, it's interesting that we were analyzing all these 9 plots of flowers and how they change in different seasons. And I can tell you that I have been raised in Isfahan, but I haven't seen that kind of asymmetrical order. So that's why we avoided intentionally showing any pictures. But you are right. I mean, when we talk about Persian gardens, it's all about all these images that we have in our mind.
I was trying to see if there are any people who haven't spoken to give. Pardon? Yeah, he's but he is. Okay, then we'll have.
I would like to ask Professor O'Kane about ceramics. I would like to ask Professor O'Kane about ceramics. Is there any connection between production workshops of domestic ceramics and architectural tiles? Because it seems obvious that all these experiments in one type of workshop can influence in other workshops.
Domestic is a rather tricky word there, because
pottery.
Certainly the ateliers in many cases were producing pottery as well as tiles. Luster is a good example, underglaze is another good example. But these were luxury products. They were aimed at a narrow section of the market. Most of the market would have been buying unglazed or simple monochrome glazed wares. Certainly at the top end of the market, there is more experimentation, there's more innovation. There's more of a market, I suppose, for that. People will pay for very fancy products, whether it's put on a building that they commission or whether it's for display within the building, as in, say, the Timurid Chini Khane, which is where they actually displayed examples of Chinese porcelain imported, and perhaps later on, who knows, some of the imitation Chinese ware that they themselves made in the 15th century. So certainly, yes, they were responsible for innovation in both kinds of ceramics.
Oh yes, there's a new hand.
I can't speak about science, but I can say something about architecture. And one thing that I'm struck with in looking at the texts that I've been looking at is that there's a constant play of similarity and difference, and it's difficult. One can't say that there are always similarities being found or always differences being commented on, but instead both of those things are happening at the same time. And when buildings in the Americas are being described by Spaniards, for example, as a plaza or as a church or as a mosque, one has to ask the question about whether or not that is a functional similarity that's being noticed, I think, or a formal similarity, maybe both of those things and maybe things apart from that. So I think it's difficult to try to see through someone's eyes in the past and to understand what's going on in these texts, but I think it is worth trying to do.
It was also sort of, I kind of, from a rudimentary understanding, the sort of reaction towards the people in the New World was that they were almost sort of barbarians and they ran around without clothes on and that kind of thing. But it just doesn't seem to sort of match up with the kind of the attitude towards the sort of advancement of the Islamic culture at the time to be able. But I guess it's just from sort of individual perspectives. So.
Yeah, and it's a good point that there is a wide variety of perspectives that one comes across in these sources, ranging from, well, they're all over the place, but it's a good point.
Possibly, rather than, there's probably a sense of otherness in terms of the sort of...
Right, absolutely.
And behind the camera?
Thank you very much for a wonderful conference. This is just an observation that throughout the conference I didn't hear yet. Something about different kind of color, which is the color of light, which is mentioned from the beginning to the end of the Quran, which I believe is the inspiration for all the kind of colors. Because through the prism of the heart comes, all of these different colors. So is that something to be covered in different conferences?
Well, actually, funny you should mention it, but Sheila and I have been talking about, future sessions, and one of the ones or future topics for symposia, and one of the ones would, of course, be light. So it's not that we haven't thought about it, but as you can see, with color being as big as it is, and no one's ever really done much with it, that we're trying to move slowly but steadily through simple words.
Because I just feel something is missing, and that's the origin of all the colors in the Islamic art. But yeah. This is wonderful to talk about the whole kind of colors, and then we are missing the point. And that's the origin of all of these colors, which is mentioned in the whole chapter in the Quran as the light.
Right. Yes, but I think that I think we mentioned this we certainly mentioned it in our opening talk about the. I think
Samir Amoudi.
Right. Exactly.
As well,
the phenomenology of light. Yes.
Thank you.
Did we have a question back? Yes. There's a.
Thank you very much. I need to share that it's such a privilege to have you all here in the same room, all you distinguished scholars. And for me as an artist and art historian, I'm overwhelmed. And I don't want to limit my question to just one. So if you could please share your thoughts about since we are dealing with Islamic art, and I know that it's important to put it in context with the history and religion and the economy and all of that, but is it possible to approach it from the artist's point of view, and would it be naive to consider that the artist, or we can analyze the work of artists as a continuum of human production of works of art in general? Is it possible to approach it from a formal academic point of view and see how the artist is dealing with issues that concerns even artists today, and how much they sacrifice their preferences in order to appeal to the audience? Is it possible to address these matters when we're talking about history, in the context of history of art, of course? So I'd like to hear your thoughts about that, if possible.
Anyone want to talk about the Anyone want to take it on? I think we heard something about it yesterday when very practically Cheryl Porter was talking about the things that were available were limited the choice that the artisan could make when making a manuscript. I think you could extend it to Bernard's paper as well, that certain things were not available, certain both techniques and materials, and that limits your choice right away. Anyone else care to take on that question? Okay, here we have a hand down here.
I don't want to try to be funny, but I think that apart from the colors of this room, we are in a Persian garden, so to say, which I think, seeing what we've seen, what I saw, could have been a Dutch garden as well from the 17th century. I mean, my garden has a few of such trees, like apple tree, etc. And one of the things that I like to see is in spring the first blossoms and the difference in colors, etc. Well, not so much the colors used. But actually, my question is more scientific, which is, have you made any comparative studies with gardens in other countries, influences of other gardens, like the Dutch garden could have been an influence, were it not that they are, but mostly made, no, they were developed in the 16th, 17th century. But they were not that much, well, they call them sort of, how to say it in English, well, a nice garden and not a very productive garden, although they were productive. But this is probably because Dutch are Calvinist, as most people think, so we think that productive is nice. Coming back to the question is actually, do you know of any influence on the Dutch garden from the Persian garden, so to say? And then my remark is that probably this, the Persian garden is not Islamic as the Dutch garden is not Calvinist.
I think your question and your observation encapsulates fairly complex issues. I think the first issue is the one of comparison. And it's slightly problematic because one is a comparison, one is a geographic comparison, the other is a comparison based at a particular point in history. We are not really comparing the Persian garden to other gardens. We are looking at the two texts and what they have to offer to us in terms of a recipe for the garden at that particular point in space and time. We would like to study gardens worldwide, but that is not a particular priority we have at this particular point in time.
I understand the misunderstanding. I mean, it's not to compare just to compare, but to see whether to try to find where the influences come from. I mean, you're talking about texts, you're talking about people traveling, and I know that a few Dutchmen traveled all over the world, and of course from other countries people came to the Netherlands. So this is more my question. Is there anything about text or whatever in which that you could use to get a better understanding of the gardens that you're working on? Am I clear now?
At least if I talk about the 14th century to the 17th century, there are rare Dutch documents that refer to gardens, but there is a late 18th century, and I don't remember the name of the traveler, who went to Persia and visited some of these gardens, and unfortunately he mentions that they were ruined. And interestingly, he's a horticulturalist, and his observation is very interesting and very detailed, and he goes back to Netherlands. But in my personal studies, this is the, this is the only detailed Dutch text that I have studied.
I'm going to take the chairman's prerogative or co-chair's prerogative now and bring our meeting to a close. It is after 5, and indeed one of our speakers already had to leave to catch a train, and I know there are others who had to go. I just want to make a few quick concluding remarks. I thought the garden was a wonderful place to end because indeed we are now going to move on to a garden. We've all been invited to the Alcazar. It will be outside. For those of you whose hotel is near, you might want to get a jacket. I wanted to say that I thought we'd had a really, really successful 2.5 days here, that we really, in terms of art history, if we want to frame it in our current art historical discourse, we've talked about paradigms and dichotomies and multi-directional approaches. We went pretty well geographically Spain to Samarkand, and even America. We kind of slighted India and Malaysia. But in 2.5 days, it's hard to get around the world. We certainly went past to present. I mean, Margot Livingston, I got an email today that she's lecturing next week, and someone was talking about her theories of neurobiology yesterday. I think we went nicely from theory to artifact, or from science to craft. We had a balance of all of those. We went local to cosmopolitan. And I think we even cast doubt on how much there is that's pan-Islamic. Certainly the Quran is pan-Islamic and our title is pan-Islamic, but there were very few things, it seemed to me, that you could immediately say, oh, this is true in here and it's also true over there. I just want to thank everyone for coming. I would like to thank particularly our students who introduced the speakers. Our VCU, of course, VCUQ team, their Cordovan supporters, and particularly again to Marissa Brown, who has been indefatigable in bringing us up to speed on all of the things that we need to do and making everything work so seamlessly. I just remind you that our next conference will be in 2011, around this time of year, in Doha. The subject will be the art of the object in the Doha Museum. The same website that you see up here, islamicartdoha.org, will carry information about it. And we hope that we will see you all there, because we'd just like to say that the subject that we've opened up today is just a beginning. It was quite clear it was just a beginning, not an end. We have much more to do, much more to think about, and we hope to see you all again in 2 years. So thank you very much. And I have one more quick announcement for those of you who don't know how to get to the Alcazar. All of our very nice guides who are here in the blue uniforms will be happy to guide you there as well. So thank you.